Good evening and welcome to the Newshour Agenda. We're bringing you this very special show from outside the Capitol building here in Washington, D.C. Of course, a landmark here. And what is, of course, going to be very, very significant is over the next 48 hours when Prime Minister Modi touches down in Washington, D.C., he's going to be amongst one of the first few world leaders to be meeting with President Trump in his second tenure as the President of the United States. Well, a lot of expectations. What are we expecting to see as far as this particular visit is concerned? Let's quickly go across to our panelists who are joining us on location. With us is Kriti Upadhyay. She's the founder of Indus Tech Council. With us also is Catherine Hadda, who's a senior visiting fellow of CSIS and also has been Consul General in Hyderabad. With us also is Raymond Vickery, who's a senior associate at the CSIS and has been former Assistant Secretary of State. Thank you so much to you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening. Let me begin with you first, Kriti. The big area where the two countries see a lot of cooperation and, there's a lot of mutual interest over there is defense and strategic cooperation. This trip as well is likely to be in that direction. Where do you see this headed, particularly because we've seen President Trump come out and say that he expects India to be actually buying a lot more of American military hardware and equipment. What are your expectations from this particular visit of Prime Minister Modi?
Thanks for having me here, Madhav. I think in the first Trump administration, we saw some major headway on the defense and security space, right? We reinvigorated the DTTI, formalized the Quad. India got the STA-1 status, which actually makes a lot of these items on the commerce list, the dual-use defense items, sort of license-free. And we also got India designated as a major defense partner. So all of these great things happened under Trump, first administration of Trump. So I think a lot of continuity on that. You'll definitely see picking up some of those threads. We also have a lot of deals on the table, right? So there are some deals that have been going on for some time now, which hopefully will see the light of the day. The GE engines are right up there. There are also some new procurements that are on the table. Just last year, we had the trials for the Stryker armored vehicles. The Javelin ATGMs have been something that the U.S. has been pushing for some time now. And then India already has some of the platforms like the maritime patrol aircrafts, the P-8Is, as well as the transport aircraft CJ-130. So there are also talks of more of these procurements. But I think there's going to be a good balance. There's going to be outright procurements as well as a lot of co-production deals as well. And as you know, Biden administration really built on some of the initiatives that Trump started. So you saw the DTTI really evolve into ISET and Indus X. So I definitely see continuity there. But President Trump could maybe repackage some of these initiatives, but overall we see continuity and we see U.S.-India defense ties continuing their upward trajectory. Right.
Also, when we talk about the Predator drones, for instance, one of the issues that has been spoken about is whether the transfer of technology can happen, and that's been one sensitive area. Do you see any movement forward on those issues, particularly when we talk about joint development, as you rightly mentioned? How much of that transfer of technology are we likely to see actually happening? Because that's something that has been an issue of concern as far as India is concerned.
I think for India, Make in India and TOT has been very critical, and I feel that U.S. understands that. Let's look at engines. I mean, engine technology is the most critical technology out there. There are only like 2-3 companies in the world that make engines, and they've spent like years and billions of dollars to make these engines. And the very fact that, even GE engines are happening with some amount of TOT and co-production in India itself is a great signal. It tells you that U.S. and India are definitely now ready to do a lot more co-production.
Right. Let's quickly, in fact, bring in Raymond as well. Raymond, one of the things that has been spoken about a lot, and President Trump, through the course of the campaign, kept talking about tariffs. But when it has come to implementation, we've seen him announce it in the case of China, in the case of Canada, in the case of Mexico. But Canada and Mexico are currently on hold. He's also spoken about BRICS. He's spoken about India. How likely is he to pull the trigger on those tariffs? And how important is this particular bilateral meeting between PM Modi and President Trump to actually figure out whether that tariff will actually happen on ground or not?
Well, thanks very much for having me. And this raises a fundamental question in regard to this particular meeting, because President Trump has made a lot of statements about tariffs. He's not only threatened and then held back on Canada and Mexico. Yesterday or day before, he's talked about 25% across the board on steel and aluminum. And then he's gone so far as to say that the U.S. will have the same level of tariff as its trading partner, which is not always suitable for democracies like India who are developing. So working around the trade pronouncements, those about tariffs, will be absolutely fundamental. Now, that having been said, you're quite right. President Trump basically comes from a business background, and he wants to make a deal. And what will be the deal? The deal will be along the lines of India being able to buy more American goods, and to see how other things play into that. So I think that the relationship is strong. Tariffs will be a problem, but I believe that Trump will work around it, and certainly Prime Minister Modi has the goodwill in order to be able to accommodate what he calls his good friend in regard to tariffs. I think it'll move on from there to energy, and that's likely to be an area. As you know, President Trump has been all in on oil and gas. I'm very hopeful that civil nuclear will be a part of that energy package. But there's an area in which there is an alignment of interest, and it plays back to the tariff questions. If you can make real progress on energy, which is in the interest of both sides, then tariffs perhaps become less important.
Right, very important, because energy, of course, a very, very important area. But I just want to come back to tariffs for one moment, because we've seen some announcements from India's side. Certain American goods like Harley-Davidson motorcycles, electric vehicles will be now taxed much less. Do you think that's enough, really, or do you think that a lot more would be required to sweeten the deal?
Well, I think that Trump is going to want to get something else that he can hold up. In my view, it won't be really absolutely substantive necessarily. Almonds have been mentioned, and there are a lot of intermediate goods which India Prime Minister Modi has said that he needs to import, and as you saw in the budget, actually, tariff levels have already been lowered on those. So I think that there is an accommodation, and of course it gets back to what was said previously in regard to defense equipment. A few more purchases there allow the president to say, yes, everything is on track, we're good friends, and then you move on to how you're going to work on other substantive matters.
All right. Let me quickly bring in Catherine as well. Catherine, of course, you've served as Consul General, and you've been in Hyderabad, one of the cities that sends a maximum number of H-1B professionals to the United States. Given the kind of positions that have been taken by President Trump in the run-up to the campaign, we saw a lot of the campaign rhetoric, but how likely is he to actually go ahead and, implement some of that? For instance, we have people such as Elon Musk who say, H-1B is very, very important because it protects American interests in the form of the technology companies and their requirements as far as manpower is concerned. What are we expecting to see on that front?
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head that the H-1B issue, which is a very important issue, which was a campaign issue, even the Trump administration itself is not of one mind on this issue. So I actually think it will take some time to resolve that issue. To some extent, since President Trump has emphasized his need to build up the AI industry, for example, artificial intelligence in this country, and Prime Minister Modi is just coming from the AI summit. In some extent, if you think about the need for skilled IT specialists as an enlarging pie because of the AI initiatives, there may be less pressure to narrow the H-1B program. And I also think there's more both countries can do to build on cooperation to get the best talent in these high-tech areas. So, for example, we have another category of visa called the O visa, which is for specialists like scientists and researchers. and IT specialists, and we could maybe build programs around that to encourage cooperation on both sides, joint degree programs, for example, between the United States and India around these areas. I think the bigger issue is the undocumented migrant issue, which until very recently got almost no attention. I actually wrote an article citing this in January. We have up to 7.25 lakh undocumented Indians in this country. So this first initial bunch, which really was about at the same pace as Obama-era deportations. The real focus was understandably on the treatment of the people themselves. But I think as the pace of these deportations pick up, it's important for both countries to signal, that they're working together to stop, trafficking rings that prey on people like this, that they're working together to inform people about the dangers of illegal migration. And I would like to see the consulates that were promised in Bangalore and Ahmedabad up and running, and issuing visas, which is another good way to cut down on illegal migration.
Right, because, I think you made a very important point over there, because the government of India's position is that no government can support illegal immigration, because India also, in some ways, is a victim of that, in that neighborhood. But the point being made, and where the opposition is trying to put the government on the mat in Parliament, as you would have seen, is about the issue of treatment, because they say, look here, is it really necessary to bring them in a military plane? Is it necessary to sort of handcuff them and bring them here to India? What do you think will be the US's sort of approach to this?
My guess is that is the first thing that's going to be worked out. That the nature of the deportations themselves can be arranged to be satisfying to both sides. I think a bigger issue is, can both sides stay ahead of the narrative? When I was in Hyderabad, we had a case of students that the U.S. government deported, saying they weren't really students. They had come, they were attending sham universities, and they knew that they were not supposed to be in the United States. The local Indian community back in Hyderabad said, no, they were innocent students. They didn't know. You're victimizing them. And it became a political issue for the local government. And that was a tiny scale. If you're talking about larger scale, you can see that more of these cases might happen. And that's why it's important for everyone to stay on the same page, because it will make it hard. If you think about the Trump base, which is against immigration, and the Modi base that wants fair treatment for Indians, you don't want the bases to come in conflict with one another, because that is the basis of the U.S.-India relationship, and its strength is the people-to-people relationship. So you don't want to risk it.
Absolutely. Let me come back to you, Kriti. The entire issue of defense purchases, also the aspect that India purchases so much of its hardware from Russia. We've seen, how instance, when it comes to Katsa, how recently there's been action that has been taken, by the U.S. imposing sanctions on Turkey for the purchase of S-400 missile defense systems from Russia. Do you think that there is, some issue of concern over there as well when it comes to India?
Well, historically, India has been taking a lot of stuff from Russia, and much of this is also sort of legacy, right? Because you have legacy equipment, it requires spares and parts and training and so on that you do need. But if you actually just look at hard numbers, if you say look at the CIPRI database and so on, India has actually reduced some of its procurements from Russia while increasing it from countries like U.S. and its allies, right? France, Israel, and so on. So India is diversifying. It's not easy. It is a challenge when you have legacy systems, when you have the fact that Russians and the like are more quick to respond on delivery timelines. It's, they're more willing to, or at least historically were more willing to share technology. But I think a lot of that is changing, and even India realizes that it's better to go with like-minded friends and like-minded partners who will also provide you that whole maintenance, support, and so on that's there. So I'm hopeful on U.S.-India defense ties, and I don't think Russia is necessarily going to be a problem. India did get some of the deliveries of the S-400, and U.S. didn't necessarily sanction India. I just wanted to also make a point on trade. I think where most of the narrative has been that there's going to be a tariff war and this, that, and the other. I think there are two underappreciated facts here. The fact that It was under the first Trump administration that we came very close to finalizing a mini trade deal or trade deal or whatever you'd like to call it. We came really, really close. So I definitely see that under this, the second time around, for all you know, we might actually close that very elusive U.S.-India trade deal. And this, I think the time is opportune also because India itself is reviewing a lot of its items and trying to reduce or remove tariffs as well as custom duties. So I really think that there is an opportunity here to start looking at some of those older talks and build on those foundations. And just a shameless plug here, Jeff Smith of Heritage Foundation and I are actually doing a piece where we think that it is actually the right time to think of a U.S.-India trade corridor. A lot of investments till now have been investments from U.S. to India, and I think reciprocity is the name of the game with
That's what President Trump has also spoken about.
Yeah. So I think there's also great opportunity for Indian conglomerates to really invest in the U.S. itself. Not for any other reason, but the fact that it's one of the safest, most growing markets that can be around there. And this also goes into defense and technology and dual-use items, because what you're really seeing then is a more natural progression of TOT that's more long-lasting than just doing TOT in certain projects and so on.
All right. Very interesting perspective there. Let me bring in Raymond Vickery on another important aspect. Now, one of the concerns that India had when it comes to energy security is we saw the kind of sanctions that were imposed on Iran. That directly impacted on India's own, energy-related issues. And the larger question that many are looking at is that whether U.S. would, do certain things such as this in the future, and what really are we looking at in terms of its implications as far as India itself is concerned?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The problem here is that we've switched in the United States from an administration that wants to have the emphasis on institutions, moving forward with the WTO, the World Energy Associations, and going to a deal-making mindset. And that is that there has to be a quid pro quo on everything. So the problem is on Iran, for example, collateral damage, if you will. It's not that India and the U.S. can't see eye in regard to energy matters, but what happens if President Trump decides all of a sudden that he's going to do something with Iran that is going to have collateral damage to India in the energy area? And this is the problem across the board. When you go to a transactional approach, it's great if you just have one or two or three different parties to it. But when you're dealing with the world, you're dealing with international relations, India and the United States are going to have to be very careful not to get crossways because of something that really is not material to the direct bilateral relationship, and energy is one of those. Now, I think oil and gas is pretty safe because the U.S. is the largest producer of oil and gas in the world today, and it's not necessary that India has to say, well, I'm going to do something with someone else that would be absolutely contrary to what President Trump might think. But I think that we're going to have to be very careful that collateral damage does not affect the relationship. This has to do with immigration, it has to do with energy, it has to do with tariffs, it has to do with the whole range of China considerations. But there is a lot of goodwill here in the United States. It's bipartisan, Republican, Democrat, across the board. We have a very large and involved Indian American community who is going to pull out all the stops to see that the relationship continues. And then, let's face it, we're the two greatest democracies on the face of the earth. And if we can't work it out, there's really not any hope, but I believe we will.
Yeah, and then also the two leaders, the very fact that they have a close personal equation. We've seen Howdy Modi, we've seen Namaste Trump take place. So do you see that also being an important part of this relationship? And he also happens to be one of the first leaders, globally speaking, to be visiting President Trump in his second tenure.
Well, it is important, there's no question. And in the past, we've had leaders on both the U.S. and India side that didn't have that kind of relationship. I'm talking about in the 70s and before. But let's face it, Prime Minister Modi is a very good politician, and he's very good personally, whether it's President Biden or President Trump or President Putin. He gives bear hugs to them all, and he can work it out, I think, and the relationship is good, not only through Howdy Modi, but the relationship across the board.
Right, and let me, in fact, bring that other aspect also in. In fact, if I can ask you, Catherine, one of the things that we're looking at is how, when it comes to NATO, President Trump's made his position very clear. If this kind of a sort of isolationist approach is taken, then what happens to fora such as Quad, which India is also a part of? That's a question that many are also posing. And how do you look at this?
I'm not sure isolationist is the right term for what President Trump is. He's transactional, and so he wants smaller arrangements. He seems more comfortable with smaller arrangements where things seem more equitable. And as my colleague said, he can cut a deal. There's no doubt it was President Trump who elevated the Quad, revived it from the days of cooperation around the tsunami many years earlier. President Biden elevated it to the leaders level. The next summit, as you know, is going to be hosted by Prime Minister Modi, and the president's already indicated he's going to attend. And so I think we haven't spent a lot of time here talking about all the ways we are going to really cooperate. And I think this is a big one because the world really hasn't changed in a lot of ways. It has in tangential ways. I think some of the pressures that the Biden administration had with the Modi government, for example. And so I think there's a wide basis on which to explore more cooperation. China remains a concern for both India and the United States and the other Quad partners. So I think that's one example of a relationship that will continue. There'll be others.
Absolutely. A huge area of convergence there. But let me ask you another important area. Civil nuclear deal that we signed in 2008. There's a lot of concern that on ground perhaps nothing has moved much, or at least at the pace at which it was expected. The union government in its budget in India has announced, the ability or the encouragement rather for smaller civil nuclear reactors. The Prime Minister is in France. They're going to be visiting one experimental reactor over there along with President Macron, and then he comes here to the United States. Do you see something concrete happening on that front?
I think it'll take some time because India is yet to make the amendments that it has announced on the civil nuclear issue. We'll have to see actually what the text looks like and whether they really address the liability issue, because that was the major issue that didn't allow the Westinghouse deal to go through for all these years. But I think there is a renewed focus here after a lull of many years. So hopefully, who knows, maybe in 6 months to a year, we'd actually see some movement there and the civil nuclear deal actually translates into something more tangible. But coming back to defense, I think one underappreciated fact again is the fact that 3 of the 4 enabling or foundational agreements were signed under Trump, and we're still trying to really operationalize them. Sure, today US is India's largest exercise partner, but I think those are areas that we'll see some more quick wins in. How can we do more complex exercises? How can we collaborate more? How can we really operationalize some of these enabling agreements? And I think the Biden administration, for its part, did some great work on defense and security, and actually not just some of the larger deals that we hear about, but also some of the smaller tier 2, tier 3 and startup players, right? How do we make some of the engagements happen there? And we saw a lot of work happen in ISET and INDISEC. So hopefully under Trump administration and with both Modi and Trump being business-minded, as my colleagues here said, we see some of that percolate down, not just in those big deals that we hear, the GE engines and javelins and strikers, which are still very, very critical, especially for things like the P8Is and sonar buoys for anti-submarine warfare or maritime domain awareness. But I think it's also critical getting some of those smaller players into the picture and enabling them. So I think those are areas that we'll actually see some quicker wins in. But sure, also very hopeful about something actually happening, materializing on the civil nuclear deal.
All right. Let me, in fact, bring in Raymond Vickery on another very important aspect. Prime Minister Modi is coming into the US from France. There's a huge AI conference that's just happened there. Vice President Vance has also attended it, apart from other world leaders. Do you think that as something, which could be a very, very important area where you see more international cooperation rather than, countries trying to compete with each other? What direction are we headed in that area?
Well, I think artificial intelligence, of course, is the new frontier. Prime Minister Modi, by his presence in Paris, has shown that India has the ability to lead in this area. India has one of the greatest well springs of technical talent in this area that is found anywhere in the world. The United States has been a leader in innovation, so there is a natural partnership here which cuts across party lines, really cuts across political lines, and even geopolitical kinds of considerations. So I think that this is a major area. I do not agree with Vice President Vance that it takes precedence over all other things, because the values that the United States and India have shared for these many years are the foundation of the relationship. So you got to get those values right. You've got to stand up for democracy. I think with the turmoil that's going on here, quite frankly, there's a great opportunity for Prime Minister Modi in India to pick up the reins and provide even more leadership, not just with their global south, but across the world. You talk about problems as being separated according to Ukraine, Iran, China, and so forth. But if you look at the map, Eurasia is Europe, it's China, it's India, it's across the board. And there's where it seems to me that the leadership which Prime Minister Modi has taken on can really provide some benefit, and getting it straightened out here with the new Trump administration, it seems to me provides a platform and impetus to see that in AI and across the board there's greater cooperation.
Right. In fact, let me take that question across to you as well, Catherine. Because you were the one who just mentioned China. The very fact that we had something like DeepSeek come out, do you think that's something that's really sends shockwaves, and we're likely to see other countries come together rather than try and form their own, AI models?
I got to say, it was a wake-up call, and we need to really see how effective this instrument is, but there's no doubt it was a wake-up call. I have to say I'm a little more pessimistic it's going to lead to greater cooperation, certainly between great partners such as India and the United States, and that's very important. But I do worry we're going to be in a bit of an AI arms race, and there is so much...
AI arms race, you think that's what's going to happen?
It could happen, yeah, a little bit.
Because between countries or between cooperation?
I think between countries in how they approach AI. Who's going to set the rules, who's going to sponsor their own companies. And so there's great room for cooperation, and the summit is an example of that, but there's also a risk of competition. In some ways, competition is not bad. It depends how it's managed. But definitely China was a wake-up call.
And whether it's used or misused, that's also a big aspect.
That's another topic. That would be an entire news program in itself.
Absolutely. Let me get Kriti also on it, since strategic affairs is your area. How do you see this AI issue playing out? Because the implications of it are manifold. It's not just about actually implementing, one technology, but the very vast swath of areas over which AI has implications. How do you see this playing out?
See, I'm not too worried about DeepSeek. I'll tell you why. The LLM's race is over, and the U.S. won it, right? Even if other countries want to replicate it, it's still a replication. And even that the way that DeepSeek was built was, sure, it was older generation, but it was still NVIDIA chips, right? So the base technology and the sort of supremacy in LLMs, I think that's done. And that's why I also have a little bit of trepidation on how whether India should also pursue its own LLM, right? Is it really worth it, or should we actually think about the next big thing? But real opportunity here for US and India is in the fact that, look, I see that US, the way the technology relationship has evolved, US has always had innovation, and India has provided the scale, be it in IT sector, be it in pharmaceuticals, and those are the enduring US-India relationships.
That will have to continue, and we'll have to call it a wrap over there. Kriti, as well as Catherine and Raymond, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us and sharing with us your expertise, your views on what the expectations from this particular trip are, and all eyes will be in about 36 hours from now when Prime Minister Modi lands here in Washington DC. It's -2 degrees, but perhaps it's going to be much warmer with the bonhomie that we've seen between the two leaders inside, of course, of the White House. Thanks so much for joining us on this special broadcast. We're here in Washington, D.C. to talk to Dr. Amitabh Ghosh, who's a very prominent space scientist, not just about the Indian space program or the U.S. space program, but remember that this is one area where there's been a tremendous amount of cooperation between the two countries. How do we take this forward, particularly with India's privatization push, and also, of course, Elon Musk's own contributions, which have reduced the cost of space transport drastically? Thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Amitabh Ghosh. Let me begin by asking you, we're at a time when Prime Minister Modi is, of course, scheduled to visit Washington, D.C. There's going to be a bilateral meeting. On the issue of space, on the area of space, we've seen a lot of cooperation in the past. What really are the expectations in the areas where the two countries can work more closely in the future?
I think one area is planetary science, where India is interested, and the US obviously has a long-form capability. And then you will see very soon, next month, there is a mission called Newshour being launched, which is a India-US. The US end is JPL, and the India end is, of course, ISRO. That is going to do Earth-based studies. So there is a lot of avenues for collaboration, a lot of dialogue going on. India is trying to obviously have, so India, I think Chandrayaan 3 is on the works, and then there's talk of sample return. There's another landing on Mars.
Chandrayaan 3 is the one that landed on the moon. Chandrayaan 4 is
Chandrayaan 4, sorry, Chandrayaan 4. So there is a lot of plans from the India end. So you have to look for synergies where there's a common interest, because the US is right now trying to go back to the moon, this time with human beings. So that's a big thing, Artemis program. That is where a lot of the funds are allocated. And then, of course, the US is interested in the outer planets, like Jupiter, Saturn. The satellites of these planets, some satellites of these, have oceans below the crust, maybe 10 miles below, oceans bigger than the Pacific Ocean.
Wow.
So the thing is, if the Pacific Ocean or the oceans on Earth could have life, why can't these oceans have life? Because it's very similar. The Earth's oceans are mostly dark after a certain 1 kilometer or so. So these are also dark oceans. So I'm just saying that you have to find a common interest. But there are many missions that are happening, and so there are a lot of dialogue going on.
But coming to several of the points that you touched upon, there is, of course, India planning its own manned mission.
Right.
Do you see, and India, of course, perhaps only the fourth country now to actually be, doing that or headed in that direction? Do you see that as an area where other countries would also be engaged in? And what are the implications of doing this manned spaceflight? Because it's technologically that much more challenging, because you actually have a human being. There has to be a lot of fail-safes, a lot of redundancies. How much more complicated does it get when you're actually dealing with sending a person into space?
Right. So this is one thing we do not realize. I think we focus too much on what the US is doing and what the collaborative process is. But there are 200 countries, and just 4 have this capability, right? So if you think of us simply as a branding tool, it's huge. It is a very big thing of the capability of Indians. And even if you forget what other countries are thinking, even if you think of your own, I think it's a matter of great pride that, India...
In terms of actually how much more difficult it is, because, we've demonstrated the docking technology, but that's just the first step. There's a lot more that has to be done, isn't it?
Yes. So So humans are very fragile animals. Right now, what it is -2 degrees centigrade, you and I are not comfortable. If it was minus 150 degrees centigrade, what would happen? If the pressure was, say you're going on a flight, you just landed, right? So if at that the doors were open, it's depressurized, you're going to instantly perish. So humans have to live within very narrow conditions of temperature, pressure. They need food, they need a place to, take a shower or whatever. So to maintain that environment makes it so very expensive. And then there's something you don't hear much. It's the concept of redundancy. In spacecraft technology, you always think of, well, if this fails, then what is the next? If that fails, what is next? Because you are dealing with human lives here. So this is why it's not sufficient that you are, say, driving a car to the Himalayas. You have to think, well, if the car fails, then you have another car. If there's somebody has a heart attack, is there something to do? So you have to think of, so that's why it makes it so very complicated. And human lives it's going to be a huge national embarrassment if something happens, right? So you cannot take a chance.
Like we're seeing here in US with Sunita Williams, which has caused a lot of commentary in terms of how that actually happened, and how close are we to even bring her back? We're not very clear at this point of time.
Right. So I think that is a little overblown. So if you look at how many days astronauts have stayed in space, this is not within the top 3. So there are people who have stayed much longer. If you were to go to Mars, it will be probably 1.5 times longer, 500 days, right? So this is within the permissible limit. And she has not flown for many years. For astronauts, it's a pleasure to be assigned to fly, right? And if there was a real health concern, there is always a vehicle parked there that will bring them back. So the reason I'm saying that if there was a real concern, I don't think any government would take the risk, or any space agency would they would instantly bring them home. So if you notice, Sunita Williams and another person also have been stranded.
Right.
Nobody's talking about the other person.
The poor person who's not getting all the attention there. So that's the one interesting thing I just mentioned is that going to Mars would take say 500 days. How close are we to that actually happening?
So it was more a money problem. The money would probably be $1 trillion. So right now, Elon Musk, he's developing something called Starship, which will decrease the cost by maybe 98%. Right. And then they'll have some interesting tricks, like you make oxygen for the return journey on Mars, which NASA's Perseverance rover has demonstrated that you can, so that you don't have to carry the oxygen, right? So you came from Delhi, you did not bring your oxygen, and it would have been hugely expensive. Probably your flight would have been 100 times more expensive. So all these, so it is conceivable. If they really tried, I think you can make it happen within 10 years. And if you notice in the inauguration speech, President Trump said that he wants to do this. Absolutely. I'm not saying that it will happen, but it is certainly within I think the cost was the main deterrent. And now, if the cost is leveled out, or there's some very interesting things happening on the science front on Mars. Okay. If you had a sensational discovery there related to fossils or something, then it would make the thing more public. There will be more public excitement. But it is completely conceivable. We never would have thought that humans would land on moon, or there would be this cell phone revolution, but it happened. So it is certainly possible. So
Musk also talks about these lunar colonies and colonies in other planets. How soon would something like that happen? 50 years, 100 years? How far away is something like that?
Okay. So let me tell you, you live in a house in Delhi, right? I live in a house. So we have a roof over our head. We maybe have air conditioning. We may have curtains. So that's called a habitation module. So my office mate at one time led the American mission to Antarctica. So in Antarctica, you have to have much better heating. And then inside, it's just like your house. Here on the moon, you would need to have oxygen, and you would to have maybe some sort of gravity. You need to have food, and not Musk, but Blue Origin's Jeff Bezos is trying to do this. And it is not at all very technologically that involved. So you have to think, say, who will use this? Is it going to be space tourists? You go to Disneyland, right? You go for a ride and whatever, right? So there's a thing to do. You go to Taj Mahal, you see, take pictures. What are you going to do on the moon? I think that's the very hard thing, which, the product market fit, right? You're trying to design this. Why will anybody want to go and, right? So the transportation cost has come down. If Elon Musk's this Starship works out, the transportation cost will come down significantly. Like you came from India, your cost was maybe $2,000. If the plane had to be destroyed after you landed here, then your cost would be 100 times more. So right now we are at this point that it costs $100, but it will become $1.5 or $4.
So just waiting for the technology to catch up with the requirements. That's what we.
The technology is there. Okay. I think for the lunar base to happen, so you can have a space station on the moon. That's not very difficult. It will be a government-funded space, but for like an ordinary person to go, that's where you have to find what will they do on the moon.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Dr. Madhav Ghosh, and explaining it in your own impeccable style. So all eyes on what really will happen. Will there be any announcements in the area of space? Two, of course, countries that have cooperated a lot in this particular area. A lot of questions, a lot of concerns, and certainly a lot of scope for cooperation indeed. Thanks so much for joining us as we brought you this report from Washington, D.C.